Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pat Christmas. I'm Policy Director at the Committee of 70, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this installment of Studio C70, where we talk about important issues of the day and how our government works here in Philadelphia and across Pennsylvania. This afternoon, we have a very special guest, City Commissioner Seth Bluestein, responsible for overseeing voter registration and running elections here in the city of Philadelphia, which has always been a very, very important job. Perhaps all the more so at this point in our democracy, at this point in the country's history. Commissioner Bluestein, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So here, let me start with this. I'm not sure how many young folks they aspire to be an election administrator. I hear a lot about being a firefighter or a president or maybe a teacher, but you wound up being an election official. Can you tell us how you found your way into this current position?
Yeah, it's amazing how many people get asked that question who work in election administration, and their answer is always the same, which is they never intended to get into this field. I went to grad school at Fells at the University of Pennsylvania for public administration. So I was learning how to be a government administrator, work in local government generally, but I never really knew much about the field of election administration in particular. And it wasn't until I got to know former Commissioner Al Schmidt, now the President and CEO of Committee 70, and his campaign to run for office in 2011 for the commissioner seat, that I really learned about election administration and got involved working with him after he won his election and joining the office in 2012.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you since you've been in this office, and as you mentioned, there's a bipartisan set of officials here, which of course it is important to have members of both major parties overseeing elections. Can you talk a little bit about how your day-to-day job has changed from being a deputy in this office versus being an appointed commissioner? I mean, I guess you may be running for re-election here, but these are elected positions. A little bit between what your job was like before day-to-day and now what it's like.
Yeah, so the city commissioner's office is managed by a bipartisan board of elected officials. They make up the county board of elections. But working with the commissioners, it takes a very large team to make elections in Philadelphia happen. We are a significantly sized election jurisdiction. There are 1,703 divisions or precincts and 8,000 poll workers, 8,500 poll workers that make election day happen. And when you're a deputy commissioner, you're working day in and day out with the civil service staff, the other employees, to make sure that the actual nuts and bolts of the election apparatus are getting into place. As commissioner, you're involved in a lot of that, but you also have more of a public role as well to represent the office for the voters of Philadelphia, to make sure that they have the information that they need to be involved in the election process, to be effective advocates for their own community and their own needs. So from an administrative perspective, not much has changed. We're still making sure elections happen. But in my new role, I'm doing a lot more speaking to the public, similar to this conversation we're having now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah. So I guess let's talk more about the important part of the job in terms of speaking to the public. I guess, like you noted, this has always been one of the responsibilities of certainly the elected commissioners as elected officials to communicate voting procedures and upcoming election, critical deadlines, et cetera, et cetera. But how much has that changed over the past several years? Let's say we know this has been a fairly tumultuous several years.
Yeah, elections have become much more complicated to run, but then the flip side of the coin there is they're also a lot more complicated to explain to the public. So since when we came into office in 2012 until mid-2019, elections had been run in Philadelphia the same way for decades. I mean, we used the same voting system. There were absentee ballots, no excuse vote by mail. And that really started changing when we implemented a new voting system that was had a paper ballot base in 2019 general election. And then between Act 77 being passed in late 2019 and being implemented for the first time in 2020, combined with managing the election during the pandemic, as well as everything we went through with the controversial 2020 general election, being able to explain all of those changes to the public so that they have all the information they need to go out and vote has become a much more important part of the role. Like you said, as an elected board, it's always important to talk to the public, but even more so now, especially when there's, to some degree, a loss of faith in the election process. And, we have to make sure that we're out there every day, making sure that voters are comfortable that they're able to vote and that when they do vote, their vote will be counted.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into the weeds just here for a few minutes. I mean, you mentioned absentee ballots a minute ago. Of course, absentee ballots we've had for decades here in Pennsylvania. They're mentioned in our Constitution. They're mentioned in regular state statute. Could you briefly kind of remind us what an absentee ballot is, your way of requesting it, of returning it, including over the counter, I guess not just previously, but currently, and then kind of also explain to us how we wound up with this mail-in ballot option as well, because I know this is something you get a lot of questions about, the new mail-in ballot option here in Philly and across the state.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, absentee ballots are in our Constitution, the Pennsylvania Constitution, and there are a number of reasons one might request an absentee ballot. As the name would suggest, maybe you're absent from the municipality, whether you're absent because you're going for work or vacation. If you're not in the municipality, which Philadelphia being a coterminous county and city, if you're outside of Philadelphia in general, you'd be eligible for an absentee ballot. Other reasons might be if you are sick or too ill to get to the polling place, if election day falls on a religious holiday, if you are working in the election, you're eligible for an absentee ballot. That in the past was able to be requested on a paper application, would be submitted to our office, it would be processed, and we would mail you your ballot. And then you would return that ballot via mail more often than not. It was always an option to go to City Hall and request your absentee ballot and return it at City Hall. But with the expansion of Act 77 into no excuse vote by mail, kind of running alongside this absentee ballot process, we've seen a lot more voters voting by mail in advance of Election Day. So we've had to put in place procedures to receive those ballots back, because part of the change was that those ballots had to be returned by 8 p.m. on Election Day itself. So it can't be postmarked, it can't be in the mail. So we want to make sure that there's opportunities for individuals to return those ballots the weekend before the election or on Election Day itself, so that their vote can get counted. So we've established drop boxes in addition to the opportunity to come to City Hall and return your ballot in person at City Hall.
Right. So it's fair to say that the same processes and steps that have always been in place for absentee ballots also apply to mail-in ballots. The one important distinction is that an absentee ballot can only be requested for very specific reasons, but otherwise, are they the same, basically the same ballot, returned and processed the same way?
Yeah, functionally speaking, the ballots are identical. They function the same way. They are processed the same way, and they get counted the same way.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned just the sheer volume of mail-in ballots, I guess, would be the other distinction. Of course, the mail-in ballot only being put into law in October 2019. We certainly didn't realize that we were going to have a global pandemic a few months later, and that would really supercharge the use of these ballots at this point. So we also know that, because of the volume of ballots that you have to, not just Philadelphia, but any other county has to process, and the fact that you can't actually begin processing these ballots until 7 o'clock in the morning on Election Day. Can you walk us through why that's such a big issue? And also, I guess, if you could give us your request of the legislature and the governor, if you had to make a change here in law, what that would be.
Yeah, one of the biggest controversies we saw during the 2020 general election was that it took us multiple days working 24/7 around the clock to process the ballots that we had received. And the reason it took so long is because there were a lot of ballots. And if you can't start until 7 a.m. on Election Day, you're going to be working all through Election Day, while also half your team is managing the in-person election and processing over multiple days hundreds of thousands of ballots. And if you have the opportunity to begin reviewing the envelopes, where the voter signs, dates the envelope, and reviewing those, and then opening those envelopes, extracting the ballots from the secrecy envelope, which is inside the main declaration envelope, flattening the piece of paper so that those ballots are ready to be scanned, and even scanning them. All of that work takes time. And if you have the opportunity to do that before election day, called pre-canvassing, you can be much more prepared so that on election day, when the polls close at 8 p.m., you'll have many more ballots already counted, and those results will be known election night. So as far as how much pre-canvassing, the counties need, it's dependent on the turnout in that particular election cycle. But, at the bare minimum, I would say you're going to need 10 to 14 days in the highest turnout elections for you to have all of those results ready to go on election night. That would be ideal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 10 to 14 days. Whereas right now, you kind of have one. It's not even a whole day without having to worry about polling places. But surely, I guess point is just not enough time at all. I guess while we're on it, so this additional time to process mail-in ballots would be hugely beneficial, not just for Philly and other big counties, but counties of other sizes. Is there another item or two that you'd put at kind of the top of the list for? Let's just assume for a second that this legislature and this governor could figure out some updates to the election law.
Yeah, one of the other things that we noticed in 2020 was that there were people whose ballots were received after the deadline to receive them, which is election day at 8 p.m. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason in early 2020 was the Postal Service wasn't functioning as completely as it should be. But also, one of the other problems is the application deadline is only a week before the ballot is due. And that's just not a realistic time frame for us to process the applications, mail out the ballots, for the voter to receive that ballot, vote it, and mail it back. And there are potentially thousands of voters who are intending to vote, who want to vote by mail, who mail their ballots back, thinking it might get received in time, whose votes are ultimately not counted because those ballots were received late. So reconsidering that time frame, whether that's moving the application deadline earlier, maybe adding an additional 3 days before the election for us to receive those applications, and or allowing ballots to be received later if they were postmarked before election day. I think all of those should be on the table for the legislature and the governor to talk through and ultimately come to a conclusion that they can all agree on for how to improve the process. Because all I know is right now, the timeline is way too tight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You think it would go without saying for our folks in Harrisburg to speak with election directors, at least across some swath of the state as they put these bills together. But I guess that's just not the way the sausage making happens. So I guess the only other thing I wanted to talk with you a little bit about was as far as these mail-in ballots go, because I guess it's fair for questions to come up, and there's certainly wrinkles to work through with such it's a notable change in election law here in Pennsylvania. And certainly this has been a challenge in several years between the pandemic and just the political rhetoric out there. So mail-in ballots have been named to come under some scrutiny, but also the ways to return them. So as you noted, these ballots, absentee or mail-in ballots, have to be in hand by 8 o'clock on election day, on election night. So you can put it in the mail, right, and make sure the Postal Service will get it back by 8 o'clock on election day. You can apply for one of these ballots over the counter, as you mentioned. Just complete the application right there, get the ballot, complete the ballot, return the ballot on one visit. Of course, again, that has to happen on election day before 8 o'clock or prior. But another option that's been made available, I guess not across the state, but in some counties, including Philly, is to have a drop box, a ballot return receptacle available. So again, this is a relatively new part of the election infrastructure in PA, pretty common in pretty much any other state with widespread mail-in voting, but has been subject to some scrutiny. Could you walk us through the drop boxes, at least the ones we have here in Philadelphia, how those are placed, how ballots are collected, how those are made secure, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so we implemented drop boxes for the first time. In the primary in 2020, we had 2 of them, one outside of City Hall and one outside of our voter registration office. And then in the 2020 general, we were able to expand that to other locations throughout the city. And those locations were distributed geographically so that they covered the entire city, but then were also placed where we thought the most ballots would be able to be returned. They were put in place alongside supplemental election offices so that we would have additional resources in communities that needed more assistance with applying for ballots, and then communities that already had their ballots but just need to return them. Those resources would be placed where they would be most useful. So the drop boxes that we put in place in 2020 are still in place now. They haven't changed. We collect ballots from them every single day from each box, and they are monitored 24/7 by a camera. And they have security notices on them, making sure that anybody that goes to the drop box is aware of what rules are in place for delivering a ballot. Functionally speaking, they are the same thing as mailboxes. You see blue mailboxes all over the city. They're a place where you can drop your ballot. The only difference being when it goes into a mailbox, the Postal Service collects it every day and then has to process it and then mail it to us. Whereas when you put it in the drop box, we collect it every day and it comes directly into our hands and gets processed immediately. That's the main difference between a drop box and a mailbox, but otherwise they're the same. They serve the same purpose.
Right. And surely at a time now where so many folks are using that mail-in ballot option, as you noted, the deadlines are tight. The deadline between application and return is very tight. So this drop box has become all the more critical. And then in the last, would you say like 3 or 4 days, perhaps?
Yeah. So I think when we're having these conversations, it's really important to look at the data to really inform ourselves on how these resources are being used. And when you look at how they've been used since 2020, you see that there's a notable increase in ballots being deposited in the drop boxes approximately 9 days before the election. And then there's another significant increase about 4 days before the election. And then finally, what you see is on election day itself, there are thousands of ballots being returned to the drop boxes, in that we have to do multiple pickups at each one so that they are able to get back to us efficiently. And what that shows you is prior to 9 days before the election, most voters are returning them by mail. They're confident those ballots will get back to us. There are no concerns or issues. But then when you get closer to the election, certainly within 9 days, that there's a real need in the community for them to return these ballots because there's a fear that their ballots won't get back to us for the mail service.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing we have them. I know not every county in the state has opted to set these up, but as you just noted, they're incredibly important. Even without the tight deadlines, I'm sure we'd see like that graph of return ballots, screaming upwards as we got closer to election day. So here, just a couple more questions for this afternoon, and then we'll let you go. To the extent that you have heard from, even read about the experiences of election officials in other counties, I welcome your thoughts on that. I mean, one of the unfortunate side effects of not just the scrutiny, but there's harassment, intimidation of election officials across Pennsylvania, across parts of the country, is that we've had a great deal of turnover, and I guess it's a combination of things. It's the harassment, intimidation, scrutiny that election officials are under, lack of support and resources, and just not having enough bandwidth to get the work done. So could you talk a little bit about what you've heard or your understanding of what other folks are dealing with across Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I know across Pennsylvania, we've seen at least 1/3 of elections directors retiring or resigning. And that results in massive turnover and a loss of experience and knowledge that is just irreplaceable. And, we're very lucky in Philadelphia to be supported by, our partners in the city government, by the security apparatus with the police and the sheriff's office, and by city council with funding, that, we are fortunate that while we get a lot of the scrutiny, being the most populous county in a swing state, we also have the advantage of having that level of support that not every county's election office has. And there's a lot of responsibility, no matter what size jurisdiction you are, in managing elections. And I can only imagine how much harder it is in these smaller counties that don't have the same type of support that we have. And the other thing that's extremely important is making sure that we keep our bipartisan nature of our election boards. And you don't want to see any type of loss of elections officials in any way that compromises that, because one of the ways to build back faith in our election system is to make sure that we have members of the board from different parties all speaking with one voice about the integrity of our processes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully, you know, the folks who are in place now across the 67 counties, they can get through this election. Looks like there is a little bit more state funding coming in, and surviving this general election. Perhaps we'll have some additional changes in law and other you know, adjustments to help them get ready for 2024, which will be on top of us soon enough. Commissioner Bluestein, thanks so much for joining us. Well, last question is this: for anyone across the city who would like to make sure that any election, not just this upcoming election, but any election is successful, what can they do?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways to get involved. You can volunteer to be a poll worker in your polling place. And since you mentioned the additional funding from the state, I just wanted to plug that the commissioners just voted to increase poll worker pay by over $100. So if you want to work on your polling place, at your polling place, you can now get paid $250 for the day. And that's a great way to get involved and learn about the process and make sure that you're helping your neighbors vote. And if you don't want to work inside of the polling place, there's lots of opportunities to engage with the process as a poll watcher for a candidate or a campaign, or even just get in touch with any of the commissioners and ask the questions that you have on your mind about how our elections work. And I know all three commissioners are happy to have those conversations.
All right, terrific. Commissioner Bluestein, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck this fall.
Thanks, Pat.
See ya.